So there are 4 different paths to publication. Traditional publishing, which is the one we all know, self or indie publishing. It has 2 names. I personally prefer the word indie publishing, meaning independent publisher. And so throughout this presentation, I refer to it more as indie publishing than self-publishing. Then there is hybrid publishing, which, as I say, is kind of what I do. I've got a mix of books that are both self-published and traditionally published. And then finally, we're going to look at vanity publishing. Right, so what is traditional publishing? Well, in traditional publishing, money flows to the author. This is absolutely crucial. There are no upfront costs that the author has to pay out. That is all covered by the publisher. So money flows from the reader who buys the book to the bookseller. The bookseller pays the publisher pays the agent, and then the author. We'll talk a bit more about agents later. The publisher, as I say, covers all the upfront costs. So they often have in-house cover designers, or they have freelance cover designers they use. They provide all the editing services. They do the formatting, the proofreading, the uploading, the creating of formatted versions, preview copies. They take care of all the costs of distribution to the booksellers. They cover storage costs, any costs that are involved in the publishing process, they cover. And then they pay the author for the privilege of having the right to do all of this with the author's book. Now, a lot of traditional publishers pay advances. So you get an upfront lump sum, and I'm going to use thumbsuck figures here, but let's say you get a $10,000 advance. There is a little bit of a catch to this, and we'll talk more about advances later. But effectively, what you have to do before you can earn royalties, you have to earn out your advance. So if your advance is $10,000, you have to earn $10,000 in royalties first, and only then do the royalty payments kick in and you start getting over and above that. Most publishers pay quarterly. Some of them do twice a year royalty payments. And in your contract, you give them the right to publish your book. And usually the contract will cover things like the length of the contract or the duration, what geographical areas that contract represents. For example, are they only doing print in the United States, or is it global? And these are all things you do need to kind of be a little bit aware of before you ever sign a publishing contract. We will talk more about advances, royalties, and rights later, but rights also includes things like audiobook rights, ebook rights, print book rights, movie rights, if you're so lucky, and of course any unexplored rights that haven't yet been invented, because as we discovered when ebooks came out, that a lot of people were unprepared because they had contracts that covered all sorts of things, but they didn't cover digital, and nobody really knew how to manage this new entity that was ebooks. Nowadays, publishers are getting a bit more savvy because there's all these new technologies coming out and coming out so quickly. They'll often put in a blanket clause into the contract that says, and any rights that have yet to be developed or discovered. The traditional publisher then handles distribution, which effectively means that they print the books, they store them in a warehouse, they transport them or pay courier costs or have vehicles that go out to a network of booksellers. They put the books into bookstores, and this is where it gets a bit tricky. So the bookstores sell your books. Did you know that if they can't sell your books, let's say the bookstore orders 1,000 books, and your first royalty statement, you're very excited, you've sold 10,000 books because 10 different bookstores have each ordered 1,000 books, and you go, yay, I've made it. Until you discover that only 100 books sold per bookstore, and the bookstores have the right to return the unsold books to the publisher, and that then gets deducted off your royalty statement, and you then discover that you've actually earned a whole lot less than you thought you were going to. This was a business model that was set up over 100 years ago because publishers found that booksellers were being too cautious. If they didn't know an author and they didn't want to take a gamble on whether this book would sell or not, they would only order, say, 2 copies. And in order to maximize sales and in order to be able to claim that they have a best-selling novel, publishers wanted to get as many books out there into bookstores as possible. So they had to make it as risk-free for the booksellers as possible, and that's how this publishing model came about. However, they then discovered that by offering this service to booksellers, booksellers were then returning the books at the publisher's cost. So now the publisher was not only paying to distribute the books out to the bookstores, but also paying to collect them all back again, which obviously added to the costs, and publishers were losing a lot of money. So what they allowed book publishers to do is to remainder the books, which is effectively to rip off the cover, chuck it away, and then keep the book with no cover on it, and effectively was considered destroyed. And officially, those books were not supposed to be sold again after that. The other thing is, obviously, once the books came back to the publisher, the unsold books returned to the publisher, they then had the cost of pulping the books in order to turn it back into more paper to create new books. So as you can imagine, this was not the most financially sustainable model, and it has kind of maybe outlived its lifespan. Publishing is in a bit of state of flux now, and because of the rise of ebooks and digital, I think a lot of this is currently being renegotiated, and publishers are still finding their way in this new world that we live in. This is particularly, 2020 has been a year that has really shown the old publishing model to have some gaps, that it needs maybe a bit of a refresh, because it doesn't always pay to have huge warehouse spaces where you store books. So as a result, publishers were often ordering limited supplies from China, where a lot of the book printing happens. And what happened during lockdown, obviously, was when international travel dried up, getting books out of China and getting even paper to print on, because a lot of the paper is made in China, became a problem. So there were shortages of printers, shortages of paper, big warehouses that needed to be maintained, staff that had to be let go because of COVID, and the inability to distribute books to stores because bookstores were closed. And I think that what we're going to see in the next couple of years is a bit of flux to this traditional publishing model as people try and figure out a more cost-effective way of working and a more efficient way of working. Now, the other thing that you'll notice with traditional publishing is that there are a lot of gatekeepers. A lot of traditional publishers do not accept submissions from directly from writers. You have to have an agent in order to get into a publishing house. So first you have to get through an agent, then you have to get through the editor at the publishing house, then you have to get through an acquisitions committee, because the editor doesn't, even if they're an acquiring editor, they often don't have the final say. It's got to go to a committee. The marketing people, the financial people all come and sit around a table and they decide, is this book going to earn them money? Is this something they want to publish? And only then will they offer you a publishing deal. So there are a lot of gatekeepers and a lot of roadblocks to getting published if you go the traditional route. But there are pros and cons, which we'll look at shortly. The biggest pro for authors is that the publisher carries all the financial risk. So effectively, if you do not have a lot of money, traditional publishing is the best way for you because you do not have to upfront any costs.